So what is the best way to structure an essay for English? When you're in your class and you do all this great work on, reading through the text and talking about characters and themes and context, and you might do some group activities. There's so much content that you cover. One of the biggest challenges I think I find that students face is how to put that all together and then prepare for an actual exam where they've got to write an essay, or just having to write an essay or a multimodal, for their assessment. So my name's Carla Sabella, and I'm the CEO and founder of Ignite Your Learning. I've been teaching for the last 20 years, and preparing to having students prepare to write, particularly when they've got to be under exam conditions, is one of the things that I and we really specialize in. So I'm going to take you through an example of how to start getting ready for the writing that you're going to need to do for your assessment way earlier than just when you get your assessment notification 2 weeks beforehand, right? So the great thing is that, people always think, with English, we don't know what they're going to ask, and there's no formula, and we don't know how to go about doing it. It's all very mysterious and elusive. It really isn't. There is actually a pretty clear structure that you can follow to be really prepared for these particular tasks. But, it obviously makes a big difference to know what that is. That's what I'm going to go through. So one of the things I find works the best is taking a chronological approach to the essay response that you're going to be working towards. And the great thing about that is, even when you haven't finished the whole text in class in terms of the analysis, you can get started on writing your paragraphs or analysis way before you actually, again, finish the text or come to the 2 weeks, prior to the actual assessment. So I'm going to use Macbeth as an example because I think that's a sort of really common one that most people know. Hopefully you know that one, but still listen if you don't, because a lot of the kind of themes and ideas and what I'm going to discuss will translate very easily to other texts as well. Okay, so when we're looking at a text, there's always a structure to a text. So postmodern texts can be quite a little bit different because they may jump around in terms of time and perspective, and that can be a bit of a different kettle of fish altogether. But when you've got a text that has a very clear plot and structure, which most texts will, this is the structure that you want to follow, right? So you've got a character at the beginning of a text and they have certain qualities about them. And then what happens throughout the course of the text is that, they face certain challenges, or there's conflicts, or whatever you want to call it. And then changes happen to that particular character, and then they end up another way than when they started. Okay, so really just tracking the development of that change is the best way to structure your essay, because that's the way the text is written. And the thing that I really like about structuring an essay that particular way is it means that you then encapsulate the whole text in your response. So then when you get a question, nothing they ask is not going to relate to what you've prepared. Okay, one of the things I find students do a lot of is they prepare all this stuff on different themes, but none of it connects with each other, right? So going to that example of Macbeth, they might go, oh, I'm going to do this paragraph about ambition, and then I'm going to do this paragraph about gender roles, and then I'm going to do this paragraph about, the supernatural, without properly thinking about how all of those things interrelate. So if we think about Macbeth, yes, he has that ambition to become king based on, what we just say at the beginning. And then if you do want to talk about gender roles, that still connects to the ambition, because it's Lady Macbeth that sort of amplifies the ambition that is sparked for him initially. And then we get to explore the great, that idea of, gender representation, where Lady Macbeth is sort of the evil one, and she's unsexing herself to be very masculine, and then, convince her husband that he needs to, kill the king and basically, become king himself. But that still related to the ambition. So if you can have a think about that, they're still totally related to each other. And then of course you've got Macbeth, who listens to her, which is a really bad idea, because from a religious standpoint, if you think about Adam and Eve is the one who tricked Adam into having the apple, and that's why they got kicked out of the garden. And, basically women are evil and, shouldn't be listened to. So, that was the moral of that story in some ways. And so that's the thing that, is coming out in the representation of Lady Macbeth, where, she is sort of villainized as someone who is not really following the role that she should have, so which for women should be that, that patriarchal society, that submissive, that submissive role, she's got ambition, right? Which is, not something that, was okay in that period of time. So the fact that she then, gets her husband by emasculating him and basically, sort of getting him to go through with killing the king is, a big no-no, right? So it ends up being like a cautionary tale for both of these figures. But, see how they're still connected. Then if we've got the idea of the supernatural, rather than doing a paragraph just on the supernatural that doesn't relate to all that, you can actually link that into the idea of ambition, because Macbeth wouldn't have had that ambition had that supernatural power not been there. Plus, it amplifies the warning that Shakespeare is creating against breaking the chain of being, because the supernatural was not something that was in alignment with the religious values of the era. Okay, so again, we're coming back to the cautionary tale idea, the fact that it's against, religious values, which the gender thing connected with as well. Okay, so they all interrelate with each other. Then as the play goes on, we see the fallout of the ambition that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth had to be very detrimental. So again, just furthering this idea that people should not be challenging the powers that be, the chain of being, the king, the queen, the theocracy of the day, right? So, and that's where we see that at the end, that tragic fall of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, has really been a result of, following through with that ambition. So if you can see how I've done that, I've just told you the plot of the actual story, basically. But what we can then do is we can apply that to the paragraphs and the essay that we're going to write. And then when we do it that way, we can, then whatever theme that they give you, right? If they give you a theme, they just ask you about ambition, you then know how to link that to supernatural powers. If you are taking the Aristotle sort of route of looking at Macbeth as the tragic hero, looking at gender representation, like any of the themes that, are linked to this particular play will be relevant when they're all connected, or they will be relevant if if you get asked a particular thing. So I'm going to give you a look. I'm going to show you an example of, so we sort of have these essay structures that we sort of come up with, just to sort of help with, like I said, that looking at that approach sort of chronologically. And, actually I really like starting with the questions. So, here are the sorts of questions you might get from Macbeth. Okay, so in his play Macbeth, Shakespeare reflects a mirror on a dark world, to discuss this with reference to the play. Okay, so then you've got to look at the dark world. So that, again, you can talk about, that ambition leads to this dark world. Then, the idea of gender and the fact that Macbeth listened to Lady Macbeth, that's a dark world. And so there's this whole notion going back to that idea of cautioning the audience that if we don't uphold the theocratic values and the values of the chain of being in this particular context, and the religious values, so values being like beliefs, then we are going to have a dark, chaotic world. Okay, so sort of going backwards from the question, like that's a really good way of seeing how it all connects with each other. And anyway, there's lots of different ones there, but what we'll do is let's go and have a look at the actual kind of structures. And this is what I suggest you do when you're bringing all of your notes together. You'll probably have heaps of tables, heaps of quotes everywhere, and then like, what do you do with all of that? Okay, so the first thing to do is make sure you really understand the context. Okay, so during the Elizabethan context, we've got the monarchy, and we've got religious values, and we've got the fact that there's a chain of being. So the chain of being that, there's like a king or a queen at the top, and then it's sort of a pyramid. Everybody goes down from there, and it even impacts like the natural elements, so like the animals and the and nature and the weather and all that kind of thing. So what you'll often find is that if there's someone has broken the chain of being, and you see this in not only Macbeth, Hamlet, King Lear, especially in the tragedies, when there's some disruption at that top level of where the king and the queen are, it really just sends Julius Caesar, it sends the rest of society into chaos, right? Including all the natural elements, right? Okay, perfect. And then we talked about, so this idea of ambition, and so the supernatural characters and themes foreshadow the chaos and loss of, that should actually say morality that would result from ambition and breaking the chain of being, i.e. murdering the king. Okay, so then what you want to do is structure the essay through the framework of Macbeth as the tragic hero. And I like doing it from the framework of the Aristotelian theory of tragedy, because it's just really clear. So you've got, you've got the hero at the start. They're a very acclaimed individual in society, very respectable, and then they make a fatal error in judgment. So they, or it's called a hamartia, right? So for example, for Macbeth, it's like he doesn't see, like he starts getting ambitious when he sees the opportunity of becoming the king, and that's a fatal error. Othello is a really good one too. You can't see the reality of things, and that's the most common one. Like the tragic hero is blinded in some way, deceived in some way, and then they make a real fatal error in judgment. So then they like take an action in alignment with not being able to see things clearly or being deceived, and that leads to fatal consequences. Okay, and that pretty much encapsulates that whole play and all of the tragedies, in fact, that definitely Shakespeare writes, but it's a very, very common way of looking at things. I think even, even Star Wars uses it, where you've got Anakin Skywalker is really like, he gets these premonitions about the love of his life, dying in childbirth. So then he starts trying to take actions that stop that from happening. And then ironically, he makes it happen by taking the actions that he takes, because ultimately, maybe it was fake and he could never have avoided that, right? But the point was he was deceived about something, or he had an error in judgment. He started trusting people that weren't the right people to trust. He took actions in line with that, and then he just loses everything, and it's a huge tragedy. So it's still a very, very common idea that's used in storytelling. But anyway, let's go back to this one. So yeah, so we've got this basic structure. We've got the hero is a superior, brave, etc. Then he has a fatal flaw. He misreads the situation. He's been blinded to something. So Macbeth is blinded by the witches, his ambition, and Lady Macbeth, let's say. And that's where you could then bring in the gender thing. And then you've got the tragic fall of the hero, particularly one that realizes, once they realize their own blindness and human folly, which reveal the detrimental consequences of human ambition and corruption, right? And so on a holistic standpoint, looking at the art, and I didn't say this before, looking at the human experience, this is fundamental to the English syllabus. Every single text that you are going to be studying is going to be asking you about the human experience and the human condition. And this is where things like themes do link in, because themes are simply just the human experience. So when we look at themes, we go love, hate, conflict, chaos, illusion versus reality. All of these things are related to a common human experience. So highlight which ones those are in your text. And people say themes, but it's really good to know what a theme actually is and why that's important. Like, why is that central to the text? Because if everybody relates to it and it's part of the human experience, then it's going to be something people are going to be interested in, right? So, because at the end of the day, these guys are, Shakespeare was an entertainer. He wanted people to come and watch his plays, and if they couldn't relate to them, then they're not going to like them, right? So that's why it's really, when we're evaluating or analyzing these texts, that's the thing to always go from. So, and extending from that, when you're looking at like an essay structure or the way you answer your question, again, all your questions are going to come from the human experience and the human condition, right? When they pick a theme, it's going to be something to do with that human experience. So then when you actually prepare something that's got to fit into a question that is going to have something to do with the human experience, preparing your essay in a way that is all cohesive is the best way to do it, right? So with this particular example with Macbeth, we're starting with the idea that he's, this really like reputable person. And then, everybody's like praising him, all hail Macbeth. But then we have the fact that the witches come in and, they start sort of like hooking him into having that like ambition, right? These are not necessarily the best examples. These are just, basic examples, but can you see how they're from the beginning of the text? That's the most important thing to look at. Because we want to look at, obviously this text is focused on Macbeth. That's the name of the text, right? Then we look at, from a chronological standpoint, where does he start? What actions does he take? And where does he end up? Basically, then that covers the entire text, right? So the next thing would be the development of their ambition. And then we can bring Lady Macbeth into here, right? And this is a great place to highlight gender paradigms of the era where women were considered evil and manipulative. So that's based on the kind of Adam and Eve, thing. So that's then, and then that develops the idea of, because the representation they make of her links back to his character. So let's say they even ask you just about his character, that still relates back clearly, right? So that's where you could go there. And then the last one here, having a look at their downfall as a result of that ambition, right? You could link to the consequences of Macbeth's fatal flaw. And then the fact that and this is a thing, really Shakespeare's plays always end up with order being restored, right? that's where they all go, right? That's not as common with more modern texts because we don't necessarily, you know, things aren't necessarily wrapped up in a nice bow in terms of like, oh, great, now everything's morally right again. You know, there's a lot more sort of gray areas in our era in terms of the way that we look at things. But with these sorts of texts, there's always going to be an ending that is very like clear cut. This is what you should never do. Don't challenge the, you know, the royal order, the chain of being, whatever you want to call it. And that's what, at the end of the day, that's what Shakespeare's purpose is. That's the point he's trying to make. So always then coming back to what is the composer's purpose overall? What do you think they're trying to say? What's the message? You know, and that's what we see here when we, you know, quotes, and then you go into your technique and your analysis, emphasize Lady Macbeth's regret regarding manipulation of her husband, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and then, you know, Macbeth is right for shaking the powers, and the powers above put on their instruments. Okay, so you've got the fact that the religious, you know, powers that be are going to be restoring order in some way. Okay, you know, and then going back down to the questions again. So Macbeth begins the play as a hero but ends as a villain. There you go, right? So discuss what forces bring about Macbeth's downfall. So now, if you'd actually followed that structure that I've just mentioned, you're just so well set up to be able to answer these sorts of questions. And then it's really just about actually practicing them, making sure you use these words in your answer. Even if you're like, oh yeah, mine already answers this, you need to make sure you use their specific words. And I've got plenty of videos about that, so you can go watch those. But hopefully this helps in terms of showing you how to start preparing for writing and doing that practice way before you come to 2 weeks before the exam. You know, that's too late, really. You should be ideally drafting something, get a paragraph done, go hand it into your teacher, obviously have your tutor look at it, or whoever it is, so that you can, you know, start getting that feedback and then improving on the actual paragraphs and the writing that you have throughout the term. You just leave it to the end of term. That's really going to be a huge limitation in terms of what you're able to develop and accomplish in, you know, in your English exams, and just really have your English skills, because this is just teaching you how to create an argument for something, you know, how to synthesize information and be able to present it in a way that, you know, answers a question and, you know, achieves, you know, a particular purpose. So hopefully that helps.